Welcome to the second episode in a legendary series about the history of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Today we'll be talking about Sussex. We'll talk about how Aelle of the South Saxons, the probable founder of the Kingdom of Sussex, fought against a possible historical model for King Arthur, and how after being defeated, the Kingdom of Sussex simply vanished for over 150 years. We'll talk about how it returned in the 660s, or at least was written about again, how it was converted to Christianity by Saint Wilfrid, and finally its conquest by Mercia. In the final days of Rome, the bureaucracy and almost modern military structure of the empire gave way to more ad hoc defenses for the empire's troubled frontiers, often centered around strongmen, some Roman, others not. Saxon shore forts in England were built from Hampshire in the south to the Wash in the north. These forts protected against the seaborne Germanic raiders who appeared as early as the mid-200s when Rome was engulfed in civil war. If a King Arthur did exist, his historical model would have likely been a cavalry officer of noble birth who led a fast response force to Germanic invasions. Indeed, the list of the 12 battles Arthur is said to have fought closely matches the names of the Saxon shore forts, where he would have counterattacked against Germanic invaders. If, as tradition holds, Arthur lived during and after the final years of the Roman Empire, then he would have very likely fought against Aelle, the leader of the South Saxons, who arrived in England around 477 AD. Aelle arrived with 3 keel boats filled with Germanic migrants. Though Rome had fallen the previous year, the south shore of Britannia was one of many Romanized enclaves struggling against barbarian invasion. According to local tradition, Aelle and his men surprised and defeated the local Romano-Britons, who took refuge in a huge forest called the Weald. Aelle and his South Saxons established an enclave at Selsey from which to expand. The Venerable Bede wrote over 200 years later that the other Germanic migrants held Aelle in such esteem, perhaps because of great deeds done back in Europe, that they elected him Bretwalda, or High King of the Germanic kings in Britain. And this would mark the high point of Sussex's power. Over the next 2 decades, Aelle led the South Saxons east along the coast, perhaps to avoid provoking the still formidable Romano-Briton forces led by that historical model for King Arthur. However, by 491, Aelle grew strong and bold enough to attack the British fort at Anderita, near modern Pevensey, the very spot where William the Conqueror would land almost 600 years later. New Saxon settlements began to dot the region. Now, going back to King Arthur, his historical counterpart may have been appointed, or perhaps appointed himself, Count of the South Saxon shore forts, and maybe even held the rank of Dux Britannorum, the ruler of the Romanized Britons. In AD 496, Aelle took a route northwards towards the Thames Valley, perhaps going through the Weald on an old Roman road still usable at the time. Aelle would have gathered men from the other Saxon villages as he went. And then the man said to be King Arthur led the Romano-Britons against Aelle's army at Mount Badon around AD 496. And this historic Arthur, who wasn't even given the name of Arthur until hundreds of years later, inflicted a crushing defeat upon Aelle and his South Saxons, thus giving us the closest thing we have to a historical basis for King Arthur, and it also means that Aelle the South Saxon could have been the inspiration for Mordred, Arthur's great enemy. Of course, we have no way to know for sure, but that's what helps to make this era so fascinating. Now, if our mysterious Dux Britannorum was the great winner of this fight, then Aelle was surely the greatest loser. The defeat may very well have cost him his life, his kingdom, or both. The kingdom of the South Saxons is last mentioned around 514 as being ruled by a son of Aelle named Sissa. However, for 150 years after that, we don't have any references to Sussex in the historical record. We don't even have any Saxon burial mounds being located in Sussex during the 500s or early 600s. Now, how can we explain the seeming disappearance of the South Saxon kingdom? Well, there are a number of options to choose from. Number one, the Kingdom of Sussex may have simply declined in importance to the point where the more powerful kingdoms like Wessex and Mercia simply took no notice of them and thus never wrote about them. It is also possible that the South Saxons simply abandoned Saxon ways and merged with the Romano-Britons, or maybe they simply abandoned their coastal enclave altogether and either returned to Europe or headed west to join the Jutes, who were helping to carve out the Kingdom of Wessex under Cerdic. Now, one of the few things we can say for certain is that a separate Germanic band called the Astingas, probably Jutes from Kent seeking new land, settled around the town that they would give their name Hastings. So why did the Kingdom of Sussex re-emerge around 661? With few written records to go on, it is very hard to say. However, we get our first reference to a king of Sussex in 661 when a man named Aelle, who was likely connected to the Mercian royal family, married a woman named Aelle, thus becoming the new King of Sussex. He also accepted Christianity as a means to gain the throne of the newly created, or at least newly mentioned, Kingdom of Sussex. In fact, as a thank you present for becoming Christian, King Aelle of Sussex received Maonwar and the Isle of Wight from Mercia. Now, the kingdom of the South Saxons would have roughly coincided with what is today the counties of East and West Sussex. Despite its relatively small size and compact geographic location on the south coast, Sussex was a complicated political unit. Its earliest charters show that it was divided among a number of kings, with a key split between East Sussex, likely centered on Lewis, and West Sussex, centered at Chichester, with both sides having their own king. At various times, the Kingdom of Sussex was able to rule the sub-kingdom of Hastings, but Hastings often switched sides between them and Essex and Kent, depending on who was strongest at the moment. And socially, Sussex developed in isolation not seen among the other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Indeed, it was one of the last Anglo-Saxon kingdoms to become Christian. While King Aelle became a Christian in 661, most of his subjects remained pagans, which, as you can imagine, made for an awkward situation. Fortunately, that changed with the arrival of Saint Wilfrid, a Northumbrian noble who had annoyed the kings of his homeland enough that they split up his bishopric, seized the assets of his monasteries, and even put him in prison for a time. Not surprisingly, Wilfrid decided to leave Northumbria and evangelized the South Saxons with great success. Indeed, he was so successful that St. Wilfrid was granted a huge estate at Cecily by King Aelle. In many ways, Wilfrid lived more like a warlord than a churchman, with a vast retinue of loyal fighters and a huge estate to finance a truly extravagant lifestyle. The bishop served huge quantities of pork and venison at his table. His retainers were celebrated for consuming vast amounts of sour ale. St. Wilfrid often engaged in hunting and warfare when he wasn't teaching the Gospels. In addition, St. Wilfrid was a champion of the papacy within the Anglo-Saxon Church, introducing Roman chants to England. Around 710, Wilfrid died and later became a saint, his relics being moved to Canterbury. And Celsey would become the center of the bishopric for Sussex. It's worth noting that Celsey was still granted importance by the Kingdom of Sussex over 200 years after the landing of King Aelle, which tells us that the Kingdom of Sussex still remembered King Aelle and his exploits. Unfortunately, all of this grandeur couldn't save Sussex from another round of foreign invasion. The joint kings Anhun and Berthun, who held power after the death of Aelle, were talked into declaring war on Kent by an exiled Kentish prince named Edric, who promised the Hastings sub-kingdom to Sussex if they helped him retake the throne from his wicked usurping uncle Lothair. And while the usurper Lothair was killed in battle by Anhun and Berthun in AD 685, the larger kingdom of Wessex took advantage of the distraction to invade Sussex and demoted the kings of Sussex to sub-kings. It would not be until almost a decade later that a Kentish nobleman named Wilfrid drove out the foreign usurpers and vassals and restored the kingdom of Sussex. After this, it is likely that Kent and Sussex became a united kingdom, holding the line against the mighty Mercians throughout the early 700s. However, we can infer that their luck ran out sometime around 750. After that time, the kings of Sussex are listed as being sub-kings to King Offa of Mercia, meaning that Mercia not only gained control of the south of England, at least in name, but they may not have even had to fight a battle in order to do so. At first, the Mercians showed some mercy, allowing the relations of the former kings of Sussex to rule as sub-kings. However, in time, the kings of Mercia would simply sweep those old Sussex kings aside and use Sussex as a sub-kingdom for lesser princes of the royal family to rule, a sort of consolation prize for those who didn't get the big prize, namely the throne of Mercia. And this situation continued until 825, when King Egbert of Wessex drove the Mercians out of the south of England, and Sussex became little more than a province of Wessex, and then finally a united England. And that wraps things up for this episode of Channel Legendarium. I hope that you enjoyed it. If you like what you saw, press like. If you want to see more, press subscribe. And if you've got anything to say, please let me know in the comments section. Thanks again for joining me, and I hope that you have a great rest of the day.